The white feather. The morning mist hung low over the rice paddies when Staff Sergeant Carlos Hathcock first saw the small farmhouse caught in the crossfire. From his concealed position 300 yards away, the legendary Marine sniper known as White Feather could see muzzle flashes erupting from two separate tree lines. North Vietnamese regulars had pinned down what appeared to be a Viet Cong patrol near the isolated structure. But through his scope, Hathcock noticed something that made his blood run cold. Small faces pressed against the farmhouse windows, and the unmistakable silhouette of children huddled inside. It was February 1967, and the humid air around and lock carried the scent of gunpowder and fear. Hathcock adjusted his position in the elephant grass, feeling the familiar weight of his custom Winchester Model 70. The white feather in his bush hat, his signature calling card, caught a brief glint of morning sunlight filtering through the mist. Beside him, Captain Edward Land studied the tactical nightmare unfolding through his binoculars. "Charlie's got them pinned good," Land whispered, his voice barely audible over the crack of rifle fire. "Those people won't last another 10 minutes in there." Hathcock had built his reputation on calculated precision. 93 confirmed kills, each one a carefully considered elimination of high-value targets threatening American lives. Enemy forces had placed a substantial bounty on his head, more money than most Vietnamese would see in 5 years. The irony wasn't lost on him now as he watched through his unertal scope, realizing that all his marksmanship skills meant nothing if he couldn't reach those civilians. The firefight had erupted at dawn when a Viet Cong supply column stumbled into a North Vietnamese army patrol near the village. Neither side had expected the encounter, and both groups had taken defensive positions in the tree line surrounding the small farmhouse. Caught directly between them was a South Vietnamese family, a father, mother, and 3 young children, who had been working their fields when the shooting started. Through his rifle scope, Hathcock could see the terror on their faces with crystalline clarity. The father was desperately trying to shield his family while bullets shattered the wooden walls around them. Every few seconds, one of the children would peek out, only to be pulled back by their mother's frantic hands. The crossfire was intensifying, with neither enemy force aware of the civilians trapped in their killing zone. "We need to call for artillery," Land suggested, lowering his binoculars. "Bracket both tree lines and end this." Hathcock shook his head slowly. "Too close to the house. We'd kill the family along with Charlie." He continued watching through his scope, calculating angles and distances with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through over a year of the most dangerous assignments in Vietnam. The farmhouse sat in a depression, with roughly 150 yards of open rice paddy between it and either tree line. No cover, no concealment, a death trap for anyone caught in the middle. The intensity of fire increased as both enemy forces attempted to flank each other, their bullets converging on the farmhouse with deadly accuracy. Chunks of wood and thatch exploded from the structure with each impact. Through a gap in the wall, Hathcock could see the father gathering his children into the smallest room, his wife clutching the youngest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. In that moment, watching the family huddled together, Hathcock was transported back to his childhood in Arkansas. He remembered his own father's strong arms around him during thunderstorms, the way his mother would hum softly to calm his fears. These people, these supposed enemies, were protecting their children with the same fierce love he'd known growing up in the American South. "I'm going in," he announced quietly. Captain Land turned to stare at his best sniper. "Carlos, that's suicide. You step into that field, both sides will cut you down before you make 50 yards. But Hathcock was already checking his equipment. Along with his Winchester, he carried a .45 pistol, 4 extra magazines, and a combat knife. More importantly, he had something that had kept him alive through impossible situations, an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and enemy behavior. "They're focused on each other," he said, studying the muzzle flashes. "Neither side expects someone to cross that field. I can time the fire patterns, use the slight depression near the drainage ditch." What Hathcock didn't mention was the calculation running through his mind. Based on the intensity and positioning of the gunfire, he estimated the family had perhaps 5 minutes before a stray round found them, or before one of the enemy forces decided to rush the farmhouse for better position. Land grabbed his arm. Even if you reach them, how do you get 5 people back across that field? Hathcock pointed to a small grove of bamboo about 70 yards to the east of the farmhouse. There's a creek bed that runs through there. Looks like it connects to the main drainage canal. If I can get them to that bamboo, we can move along the waterline. At 0847 hours, Staff Sergeant Carlos Hathcock rose from his concealment and began walking across the open rice paddy toward the firefight. The white feather in his hat became a banner of defiance against the morning sky, visible to anyone who cared to look. Behind him, Captain Land whispered a prayer that his best sniper wasn't about to become another casualty in a war that had already claimed too many good men. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you choose between the mission and the moment when everything human is at stake? He moved with deliberate, measured steps, his rifle held at the ready, white feather visible against his camouflaged bush hat. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the mist and leaving him completely exposed on the flooded rice paddies near Unlock. The water reflected the sky like a mirror, and Hathcock felt as if he were walking across the heavens themselves, except that heaven was filled with the sound of automatic weapons fire. The first enemy fighter to spot him was a Viet Cong machine gunner positioned in the western tree line. The sudden appearance of an American sniper walking calmly through their battlefield so stunned the man that he hesitated for crucial seconds before swinging his weapon around. That hesitation cost him his life as Hathcock's Winchester barked once, the .30-06 round, finding its target at 180 yards. The shot changed everything. Both enemy forces suddenly realized they had the most wanted American sniper in Vietnam walking through their midst. The bounty on White Feather's head was worth more than most of them would see in 5 years. Individual weapons began turning away from the interfactional firefight and toward the lone figure crossing the paddy. Hathcock used their confusion and greed to his advantage. As rifle fire began crackling around him, he moved in an unpredictable pattern. 3 steps forward, pause, 2 steps left, pause, 4 steps forward. His movements appeared random, but they were based on his reading of the enemy positions and their fields of fire. When a North Vietnamese sniper in the eastern tree line lined up a shot, Hathcock was already moving, the bullet passing through space he had occupied a second earlier. The sound of gunfire had a different quality in the thick, humid air of Vietnam. Back home in Arkansas, Hathcock had hunted deer in crisp autumn mornings, where every shot echoed cleanly through the hills. Here, the tropical heat seemed to muffle and distort the sounds, creating an otherworldly symphony of violence that he'd never quite grown accustomed to. At the farmhouse, the Vietnamese father had seen the American approaching and understood immediately what was happening. When Hathcock reached the shattered doorway, the man had his family ready to move. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The universal language of a parent protecting their children required no translation. "Stay behind me," Hathcock said in broken Vietnamese, one of the few phrases he had learned during his tour. "When I move, you move." The father lifted his youngest daughter while his wife gathered the 2 boys, ages perhaps 6 and 8. Up close, Hathcock could see the family more clearly than through his scope. The mother wore a simple white ao dai stained with mud from the rice fields. The children's eyes were wide with terror, but they followed their parents' lead with the remarkable composure that seemed to characterize Vietnamese children in this war. The return journey began as a nightmare of precision, timing, and calculated risks. Hathcock led the family in short rushes across the open ground, using his intimate knowledge of how enemy fighters thought and reacted. When they paused behind the slight rise of a rice paddy dike, bullets would crack overhead exactly where he predicted. When they sprinted across the most exposed sections, he had already eliminated the shooters with the best angles. His Winchester spoke 4 more times during that crossing. Each shot was a life-or-death decision made in split seconds, a Viet Cong fighter rising with an AK-47, an NVA regular with an RPG, enemy soldiers who had moved to cut off their escape route. But Hathcock's greatest weapon wasn't his marksmanship. It was his ability to think like the enemy and stay 1 step ahead of their reactions. The bamboo grove that had looked so close from his original position seemed to take forever to reach. The youngest child was crying, terrified by the gunfire and chaos around her. The 2 boys stayed remarkably calm, trusting in their father and the tall American who moved with such deadly confidence. As they moved, Hathcock noticed details that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The way the mother hummed softly to her daughter, the same kind of wordless lullaby his own mother had used. The father's hands, calloused from working the rice paddies, so similar to his grandfather's hands from working Arkansas farmland. These people weren't the faceless enemy he'd been trained to see. They were farmers, parents, human beings caught in the crossfire of a war they hadn't chosen. When they finally reached the drainage canal, Hathcock positioned the family in the deep cover of the bamboo and called for extraction on his radio. The thick green stalks provided blessed concealment from the ongoing firefight, though stray bullets still cracked overhead with disturbing frequency. While they waited, the youngest child stopped crying. She looked up at Hathcock with curious eyes, reaching toward the white feather in his hat. Without thinking, he removed it and handed it to her. She turned it over in her small hands, examining it with the intense focus that only children possess. "Come on," the father said quietly. "Thank you." Hathcock nodded, understanding the weight behind those simple words. In that moment, crouched in a bamboo grove with a Vietnamese family while 2 enemy forces fought around them, he felt the foundations of everything he'd been taught about this war beginning to shift. The radio crackled to life. Captain Land's voice came through the static. "Extraction team en route. ETA 15 minutes. Hold position and stay low." 15 minutes felt like hours as they huddled together in the bamboo. The fighting continued sporadically around the farmhouse, but the intensity had decreased. Both enemy forces seemed to have realized that their primary objective, the American sniper, had escaped, and they gradually began to disengage. Captain Land arrived 27 minutes later with a full squad and a radio operator. By then, the enemy firefight had resumed its original intensity as both forces gave up their hunt for Whitefeather and returned to their factional engagement. The irony wasn't lost on Hathcock. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, supposedly allies, had been shooting at each other with the same ferocity they usually reserved for Americans. The extraction team moved efficiently through the bamboo grove, establishing a defensive perimeter while the Vietnamese family was prepared for transport. Hathcock watched as the mother carefully folded the white feather into her ao dai, hiding it close to her heart. The gesture was so natural, so protective, that it reminded him of his own mother preserving his childhood treasures. "Carlos, what the hell were you thinking?" Land demanded as they made their way toward the landing zone. "Walking into a crossfire to save civilians. That's not our mission here." Hathcock didn't answer immediately. He was watching the 2 boys walk hand in hand, staying close to their parents as helicopters approached in the distance. The youngest child rode on her father's shoulders, occasionally looking back at the American sniper who had given her the feather. "Sometimes the mission finds you," he finally replied. The Vietnamese family was evacuated to a secure compound near Da Nang, where they would spend the remainder of the war under American protection. As the helicopter lifted off, Hathcock saw the little girl wave from the window, the white feather still clutched in her small hand. Back at base, the official report listed the incident as reconnaissance patrol with enemy contact. 5 confirmed kills. The paperwork made no mention of the family, the crossfire, or the decision that would haunt Hathcock for years to come. But word of what had happened spread through the Marine units operating in Nye Corps anyway, carried by the extraction team and the radio operators who had monitored the mission. That evening, Hathcock sat in the mess hall, picking at his sea rations, while other Marines discussed the day's operations. The familiar taste of processed ham and lima beans, ham and motherfuckers, as the troops called them, seemed particularly unappetizing. Around him, conversations flowed between complaints about the heat, speculation about upcoming operations, and the eternal soldier's pastime of counting days until rotation home. "Heard you went soft today," said Staff Sergeant Mike Morrison, a fellow sniper from Alabama. "Risking your neck for some gooks." The word hit Hathcock like a physical blow. 3 hours ago he had watched a Vietnamese mother sing to her terrified child. He had seen a father's hands shake as he lifted his daughter to safety. He had looked into human eyes and recognized something universal, the love of a parent for their children. They were civilians, Hathcock said quietly. "They're all civilians until they pick up a rifle," Morrison continued. "You think that family wouldn't turn you over to Charlie for a bag of rice? You're living in a fantasy, Carlos." Hathcock pushed away his tray and stood up. The mess hall conversation seemed to fade into background noise as he walked outside into the humid Vietnam evening. The air smelled of diesel fuel, cooking fires, and the ever-present dampness that characterized the monsoon season. In the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder, a constant reminder that the war continued regardless of individual moments of doubt. Near the perimeter fence, he found Corporal Danny Williams cleaning his rifle by lamplight. Williams was barely 19, a kid from Detroit who had been in country for only 2 months. He looked up as Hathcock approached. "Sarge, is it true what they're saying? About you saving that family today?" Hathcock sat down on an empty ammunition crate. "What do you think about it, Williams?" "My grandmother always said you judge a man by what he does when nobody's watching," Williams replied. "But out here, I don't know what to think about anything anymore." In the gathering darkness, the two Marines sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The night sounds of Vietnam surrounded them. Insects chirping, distant radio chatter, the occasional crack of sniper fire from other sectors. Somewhere in that darkness, Hathcock knew, a Vietnamese family was settling into new quarters, probably wondering if they would ever see their home again. A letter had arrived that morning from his wife Jo back in Arkansas. She wrote about normal things, the weather, neighbors, her job at the local diner. Reading her words, Hathcock had felt the familiar pang of homesickness that hit every soldier in a war zone. But now, after the events of the day, he found himself wondering how he would ever explain to her what he had seen, what he had done, what he was beginning to understand about the nature of this conflict. "Williams," he said finally, "you ever think about what we're really doing here?" The young Marine looked up from his rifle. "Following orders, Sarge. Protecting America. That's what they told us in boot camp." "Yeah," Hathcock replied. "That's what they told us." But as he looked out over the wire toward the rice paddies, where the morning's drama had unfolded, Hathcock felt something shifting inside him. The white feather had been more than just his calling card. It had been a symbol of his certainty, his purpose, his identity as White Feather, the legendary sniper. Now, a Vietnamese child carried that feather, and with it, a piece of his old understanding of the world. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. How long can certainty survive when faced with the undeniable humanity of those you've been taught to see as enemies? 3 weeks after the incident at Anlock, Hathcock received a letter that would change everything he thought he understood about his mission in Vietnam. It arrived with the regular mail delivery, mixed in with packages of cookies from home and Dear John letters that broke young hearts across the firebase. The envelope bore the official seal of Marine Corps Intelligence, but the contents were far from official. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note from Major James Mackenzie, an intelligence officer stationed near Da Nang. The photograph showed the Vietnamese family Hathcock had saved, now settled in the refugee compound. The father was working as a translator for American forces, his knowledge of the local area proving invaluable for operations planning. The mother had found work in the compound's medical clinic, helping American medics communicate with wounded Vietnamese civilians. But it was the note that stopped Hathcock cold. "Carlos, thought you should know. The man you saved is Nguyen Van Duc, former South Vietnamese Army intelligence officer. His knowledge of VC supply routes in the An Loc sector has already led to 3 successful interdiction missions. His wife was a schoolteacher before the war, now helping our medics save lives on both sides. The children are learning English. The little girl asks about the tall soldier with the white feather every day. You didn't just save a family that morning, you preserved assets that have likely saved dozens of American lives since. Sometimes the mission finds us in unexpected ways." Mackenzie. Hathcock read the note 3 times before the full implications sank in. The family hadn't been random civilians caught in crossfire. They had been exactly the kind of people America was supposed to be protecting in this war. A former ARVN officer and his family, displaced by the very forces they opposed, nearly killed in a firefight between competing communist factions. That evening, he sat in his hooch, writing a response to his wife's latest letter. Joe had written about the anti-war protests spreading across Arkansas, how neighbors were beginning to question what American boys were dying for in Southeast Asia. She asked, with characteristic directness, whether he believed in what he was doing. For weeks, he had struggled to answer that question. Now, staring at the photograph of Nguyen Van Duc's family, he felt some of his certainty returning. But it was a different kind of certainty, more complex and harder to explain. Outside his hooch, he could hear other Marines engaged in the eternal soldiers' debate about the war's purpose and progress. Voices carried clearly in the still evening air, mixing country drawls with city accents, optimism with cynicism, youth with premature aging. "My brother says they're protesting the war at his college," said Private Jenkins, barely 18 and already on his 2nd tour. "Says we're fighting the wrong enemy for the wrong reasons." "Your brother's never seen what Charlie does to villages that cooperate with us," replied Sergeant Torres. "Maybe he should spend some time out here before he starts judging." Hathcock folded the photograph and placed it carefully in his footlocker, next to the growing collection of letters from home. Each letter seemed to represent a different version of America. Joe's Arkansas, where neighbors still supported the war but asked harder questions. Jenkins' brother's college campus, where protest signs called for immediate withdrawal. Torres' East LA neighborhood, where Gold Star mothers hung flags for sons who wouldn't be coming home. The next morning brought a new mission briefing. Intelligence had identified a North Vietnamese sniper operating in the same sector where Hathcock had rescued the family. The enemy marksman had killed 3 American soldiers in the past week, always from positions near civilian areas where return fire was difficult to coordinate. "Your job is simple," Captain Land explained to the assembled sniper teams. "Find him and eliminate him. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Positive identification required. Minimize civilian casualties." As Hathcock prepared his equipment, he found himself thinking about the enemy sniper. Another professional, probably not much different from himself, skilled with a rifle, trained to kill from distance, operating in a war zone where the lines between combatant and civilian often blurred beyond recognition. The mission took them back to the rice paddies near An Loc, where the morning mist still hung low over the water, just as it had 3 weeks before. The farmhouse where the family had sheltered showed obvious signs of repair. New thatch on the roof, fresh mud in the bullet holes. Someone was making it habitable again, reclaiming normal life from the chaos of war. Through his scope, Hathcock studied the tree lines where the enemy sniper might be hiding. Somewhere in that green maze was another man with a rifle, probably looking through his own scope, searching for American targets. The hunter and the hunted, playing a deadly game where the stakes were measured in letters home that would never be written. Movement. 2 o'clock. 300 yards, Land whispered. Hathcock shifted his aim, finding the target through his unearthly scope. A figure in black pajamas moved carefully through the bamboo, rifle in hand. For a moment the enemy sniper paused, and Hathcock could see his face clearly. Young, focused, professional. Another soldier in another army, fighting for reasons that probably seemed just as valid from his perspective. The crosshairs settled on the target. Hathcock's finger moved to the trigger, muscle memory from 93 previous kills taking over. But in that instant before firing, he thought about the photograph in his footlocker, about Nguyen Van Duke working with American intelligence, about children learning English in a refugee compound, about the complexity of a war where nothing was as simple as the briefing suggested. The Winchester fired, and another name was added to the count. 2 months later, Carlos Hathcock sat in the office of Colonel Robert Hayes at the Marine base near Da Nang, staring at a classified report that would fundamentally alter his understanding of everything he had experienced in Vietnam. The document, stamped secret in bold red letters, contained intelligence assessments that had never made it into the official briefings given to field personnel. "I'm showing you this because of what happened at Unlock," Colonel Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of a career soldier who had seen too much. "Because you need to understand the larger picture of what you accomplished that day." The report detailed the true scope of factional fighting between North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong units in the region around Unlock. What Hathcock had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of conflict that intelligence officers had been tracking for months. The communist forces, supposedly unified in their opposition to American presence, were actually engaged in their own civil war over control of territory, resources, and political direction. "The family you saved," Hayes continued, turning to a specific section of the report, Nguyen Van Duke and his wife Mai. "Before the war, he was one of our most reliable intelligence assets. After you pulled them out, he's provided information that's led to 12 successful operations and probably saved 50 American lives. But here's what you need to know. He wasn't just a former ARVN officer. He was also secretly passing information to us about VC activities in his village." Hathcock felt something cold settle in his stomach. That's why they were caught in the crossfire. "Not caught," Hayes said quietly. "Targeted. The VC unit knew about his cooperation. The NVA unit was trying to eliminate him as a potential asset. That firefight wasn't accidental. It was an execution that you interrupted." The colonel opened another folder, revealing photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft over the past 2 months. The images showed the same rice paddies where Hathcock had made his desperate crossing, but from a strategic perspective that revealed patterns invisible from ground level. "Look at this," Hayes said, pointing to specific locations marked on the photos. "These are confirmed sites where factional fighting has occurred between communist forces. 17 separate incidents in the past 60 days. They're killing each other faster than we're killing them in some sectors." The revelation hit Hathcock like a physical blow. All those nights he had lain awake questioning his actions, wondering if he had betrayed his mission by saving enemy civilians. And the truth was that he had prevented the execution of an American intelligence asset and his family. But even more disturbing was the broader implication of what Colonel Hayes was showing him. The enemy wasn't the monolithic force portrayed in briefings and news reports. They were fractured, fighting among themselves, as confused and uncertain about the war's direction as many Americans had become. "Why wasn't this information shared with field personnel?" Hathcock asked. Hayes closed the folders and leaned back in his chair. Because Washington wants to maintain the narrative of a unified communist threat. Admitting that our enemies are fighting each other as much as they're fighting us complicates the story, makes it harder to justify continued escalation. The colonel stood and walked to the window, overlooking the sprawling base complex. In the distance, helicopters were landing and taking off in regular intervals, carrying supplies, reinforcements, and wounded soldiers between fire bases and field hospitals. The machinery of war continued its relentless operation, regardless of the political and strategic complexities that drove it. Carlos, I'm telling you this because you've earned the right to know. Your actions at Unlock saved not just a family, but a valuable intelligence asset. You followed your instincts as a Marine and as a human being, and you made the right call. But you can never discuss what I've shown you today. Not with your fellow Marines, not in letters home, not in any official report. Hathcock thought about the white feather he had given to little Mai Duke in the bamboo grove. That simple gesture, made without thinking, had become a symbol of something he was only beginning to understand. In a war where truth was often the first casualty, small acts of human decency sometimes accomplished more than strategic bombing campaigns. What about after the war, sir? What about when people ask what we really accomplished here? Colonel Hayes was quiet for a long moment, still staring out the window. That's the burden every soldier carries home, Carlos. The knowledge that the real story is always more complicated than the one that gets told. You'll have to decide for yourself how much truth you can live with and how much you can keep silent. That night, Hathcock wrote a letter to his wife that he would never send. In it, he tried to explain the weight of secrets, the complexity of enemies who fought each other as fiercely as they fought Americans, the impossible moral calculations that war demanded from ordinary men. He wrote about a Vietnamese family that represented everything America claimed to be protecting, and about the bitter irony that saving them had been seen as a betrayal of mission until classified intelligence revealed the larger truth. The letter ran 15 pages, filled with questions that had no easy answers and observations that would probably never make it into any official history of the Vietnam War. When he finished writing, Hathcock folded the pages carefully and placed them in his footlocker, next to the photograph of the Nguyen family and the growing collection of correspondence from a home that seemed increasingly distant and impossible to explain. Outside his hooch, the war continued its grinding progression. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Radio chatter maintained the constant coordination of military operations. And young men prepared for missions that would test their understanding of duty, honor, and the price of survival in a conflict where the rules changed faster than the tactics. The war ended for Carlos Hathcock 8 years after that morning in the rice paddies, when the last American helicopters lifted off from the embassy roof in Saigon on April 30th, 1975. But his war, the questions raised by a white feather given to a frightened child, would continue for the rest of his life. He returned to Arkansas carrying secrets that felt heavier than his duffel bag. Joe met him at the airport, and for a moment, seeing her face in the crowd of families greeting returning soldiers, he felt the possibility of forgetting, of resuming the life that had been interrupted by 3 tours in Southeast Asia. But that possibility lasted only until she asked the inevitable question, was it worth it? In the years that followed, Hathcock would become a legend in Marine Corps sniper training, his technique studied and his record respected. Officially, his confirmed kill count stood at 93, each one documented and verified according to military procedures. But the number that haunted him was 5, the additional kills he had made while crossing that rice paddy to save a Vietnamese family, kills that had saved American lives by preserving an intelligence asset he hadn't known existed. The irony of his most questioned action becoming his most strategically valuable would follow him through retirement from active duty. Through his years training new generations of Marine snipers, through quiet evenings on his Arkansas porch, when the weight of unspoken truths seemed particularly heavy. It was in 1985, 10 years after the fall of Saigon, that Hathcock received a letter that would complete the circle begun by his impulsive gift of a white feather to a terrified child. The envelope bore a Canadian postmark, and inside was a photograph that stopped his heart. The image showed a young woman in graduation cap and gown, standing next to an older Vietnamese couple that Hathcock recognized immediately despite the years that had passed. Nguyen Van Duc looked grayer, lines of hardship etched more deeply around his eyes, but his smile was genuine as he stood beside his daughter. May Duc, now calling herself Mary, had just graduated from the University of Toronto with a degree in medicine. The accompanying letter, written in careful English, began simply, "Dear Mr. Carlos, do you remember a little girl you gave a white feather to in Vietnam? I never forgot the tall American soldier who saved my family. I became a doctor because I wanted to save people the way you saved us." The letter went on to describe the family's journey after the war, their time in the refugee compound near Da Nang, their eventual evacuation to the Philippines as Saigon fell, their sponsorship by a Canadian church group, their gradual adaptation to life in North America. Nguyen Van Duc had worked as a translator for Vietnamese refugees while Mai and her brothers attended school. The mother, Tran Thi Mai, had eventually completed her education and worked as a nurse until her death from cancer 3 years earlier. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to Hathcock's eyes. "I still have your white feather. It sits on my desk in my first medical office, where I can see it every day. It reminds me that sometimes, in the middle of terrible circumstances, there are people who choose to do what's right instead of what's easy. I hope you know that your kindness that day changed everything for my family. We named our medical clinic in Toronto White Feather Family Medicine because of you. Thank you for showing a scared little girl that there is still goodness in the world." Hathcock sat on his porch for hours after reading that letter, watching the sun set over the Arkansas landscape he had dreamed about during those long nights in Vietnam. The weight of secrets hadn't diminished over the years. He still carried the classified knowledge about factional fighting among communist forces, still knew truths about the war's complexity that had never made it into public discourse. But Mary Duke's letter provided a different kind of truth, one that measured success not in strategic objectives achieved or enemy casualties inflicted, but in lives preserved and human dignity maintained. The official reports had listed his actions at Unlock as reconnaissance patrol with enemy contact, 5 confirmed kills. But word of what had really happened had spread through Marine units anyway, carried by soldiers who understood that some stories were too important for official documentation. The image of Carlos Hathcock walking alone across an open field under fire to save a Vietnamese family had become part of his legend, though it was a story he rarely told himself. Years later, after the war had ended and historians began the long process of analyzing America's involvement in Southeast Asia, military scholars would struggle to quantify White Feather's impact on the conflict. His 93 confirmed kills were impressive statistics, but they told only part of the story. The psychological effect of his presence had forced enemy forces to change their tactics, keeping high-value targets away from areas where he might be operating. But for the Marines who served with him, Hathcock's legacy wasn't measured in body count or tactical victories. It was measured in moments like that February morning when he proved that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict, there was still room for simple human decency. The sniper who had become synonymous with death had risked everything to preserve life. In 1999, Carlos Hathcock died peacefully at his home in Arkansas, surrounded by family and carrying secrets that would die with him. The classified reports about factional fighting among communist forces remained locked away in government files. their revelations about the war's complexity still considered too sensitive for public consumption. But in Toronto, Dr. Mary Duke continued her work at White Feather Family Medicine, treating refugees and immigrants from around the world. Above her desk, in a simple frame, sat a single white feather, yellowed with age but carefully preserved, a tangible reminder that heroes sometimes step out of the mist when you need them most, even in the middle of hell. The Vietnamese father had named his youngest daughter Long Trang, White Feather, in honor of the American who had saved his family. She had grown up carrying a story that seemed impossible to believe, until she learned that the most important truths are often the hardest to explain and the most necessary to preserve. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. When the shooting stops and the reports are filed, what remains is not the strategic value of decisions made, but the simple fact that someone chose mercy over military doctrine, humanity over hatred, and hope over the easier path of indifference.